pleased to welcome Michael Kauffmann, and now I've lost my notes, an educator, ecologist, and author based in Humboldt County. He's released a number of books through his publishing company, Backcountry Press. The latest is The Klamath Mountains, A Natural History, a topic we're going to dive into tonight. So after Michael's presentation, I'll spend a few minutes talking about Oregon Wild's work in this region, and we'll save about 10 minutes or so at the end for questions and answers. You can enter your questions at any time using a little Q&A bubble on your webcast interface, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can at the end. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Chandra. All right, so I am going to take us on a journey across the Klamath Mountains. And I need just a second here to get my mode set up. So this is one of, I'm going to tell you some stories from the book, basically, and celebrate this region that I've grown to love over the last 25 years. And really, this is a love story. This is a book that came about over 10 years of dedicated work. I first wrote a book and finished a book in 2012 that also took me 10 years, and it was focused on just the conifers of the Klamath Mountains. It's called Conifer Country. And as I was writing that, I realized that this region needed a full natural history. And I'm going to tell you the story of what we put together, some small parts of that. I wish I could tell more, but I guess you could always get the book. And I want to remember that these Klamath Mountains, this is a gift. This is a place to be celebrated, to be loved, and to be stewarded. And I'm going to use the word love a lot tonight. Hopefully you'll see the importance of that by the end here. So there's two assumptions for understanding the importance of natural history. The earth is a gift, not a problem. It's easy to fall into that trap where, we've got to fix it. We've got to fix it. And obviously we do, but we also have to remember to celebrate this place, and we have to love it. And that is as important as grieving for it. And that's what the story that I want to tell for this natural history. And like I said, love is something as scientists, we don't often discuss. We're unaccustomed to discussing, but I'd like to argue that this is one of the only ways to move forward with sustainability and stewardship for the Klamath Mountains and the earth itself. And why? What fosters passion and love for the natural world? Well, it's natural history. And the Natural History Institute, this is Tom Fleischner, who I've based a lot of this understanding of natural history on. Tom Fleischner says, natural history is the practice of intentional focus, attentiveness, and receptivity to the more than human world, guided by honesty and accuracy. And that's what Justin Garwood and I as co-editors present in our book. But loving the earth, why do we need to love the earth? Well, it leads to this caring, to stewardship, to sustainability. And natural history, in my opinion, leads to this love. It leads to caring, and it ultimately leads to sustainability. And that's what we need more of. Natural history is a practice as well. We've evolved to practice this. These are my boys during the COVID times when my wife and I cooked up all sorts of fun activities to outside, because we're lucky enough to live in a 5-acre redwood forest. But through this process, we gather information about the natural world. And if anyone has ever doubted, again, watch kids and interact with nature. But also, natural history is a story, and we're a storytelling culture. And that was the best part of this book, was finding all these little stories, sidebars, full floras of say the montane conifer forest, and weaving those together across the chapters. And this was with 34 authors. So Justin and I led the charge here for 10 years to make this happen, but we weaved it with 32 other authors. We had native Karuk, Hupa, and Yurok help tell some of these stories. And these stories are all intermixed and interwoven and interconnected throughout the book. And we are, like I said, we're a storytelling culture, but unfortunately not all ecological stories are told in a compelling way. And I'm not, disregarding the importance of scientific papers, but they're often inaccessible to many people. And that's what I think is exceptional about a natural history, not just our natural history, but any natural history, is that it tells a broader, more reaching story that can reach the amateur to the expert alike. And I'm proud to say that the Klamath Mountains in Natural History does that as well. All right, so I'm going to dive in. And I want to remind us again, the Klamath Mountains are a gift, and this is our love story. And so here are the 14 chapters in the book. And we hope, again, that this is a vehicle for telling meaningful stories and connecting more place-based, experiential stories and experiences, again, with this place that I've grown to love. And I'm only going to get to touch on, like I said, just small bits and pieces of all of these chapters, but you can see kind of how we organized it with, we start with, these connections. Klamath is a teacher with Keith and Matt and Dawn and Charlie, and they're the native connection there. And they talk about how they learned their connection to the natural world through the Klamath Mountains. But then I think what's interesting and different about our natural history is we focus a little bit on cultural history, with the First Peoples chapter by Frank Lake, and then the Western Science, the arrival of Western Science by Jim Agee. Then we touch on abiotic and how the abiotic drives the biotic. And we end with some change in stewardship and looking to the future of the Klamath Mountains. So let's dive in. Let's hear some stories. So I'm going to tell you these stories in 4 parts. We're going to look at patterns across the Klamath. We're going to look at diversity and adaptations. We're going to look at relationships. And then we're going to end with perseverance. And that's really a big theme within the Klamath Mountains, is the perseverance of things. All right, well, let's start with some patterns. And let's first look at the pattern of what the heck is the Klamath Mountains? What are the Klamath Mountains? How are they defined? And natural history is born out of definable landscapes. And the Klamath Mountains in natural history is built on the Klamath Mountains Geomorphic Province. And this is, of course, rock type. And this rock type is older than everything that surrounds it. So if we start, deeper onto the continent, of course, the Klamath Mountains would actually be a little bit bigger if it hadn't been for the Cascades covering them up. Particularly, it's really easy to see if you've ever driven the I-5 corridor between basically Ashland, Medford, towards Grants Pass. You're right on that lava flow where the Klamath Mountains actually goes under the newer Cascades. And then on the eastern edge of the Klamath, it's a similar but different story. It's a newer rock, but it's newer because it's been more recently accreted onto the continent. So, but the Klamath Mountains are not easy to understand. And I love this quote from Bubba Hughes, who's from Mount Shasta. He says, "So overlooked are some of these mountain areas that they have escaped appellation and they remain anonymous in the truest sense of the word." Most people in Oregon know the Klamath Mountains as the Siskiyous, but the Siskiyous are an appellation of the Klamath Mountains. The Klamath Mountains are the whole province. But within the Klamath, we have the Siskiyous, we have the Marbles, we have the Salmon, we have the Scott, we have the Trinity, and they're all different in some amazing ways, right? Their formation, how they formed. The Trinity Alps are more connected with the Sierra Nevada. The Scott Mountains are ophiolitic sequence. It's 400 million years old, and ophiolites, I'm not going to get into a bunch of it, but we'll see a picture in a minute. These are things that were formed under the surface of the ocean millions and millions of years ago and then dumped onto the continent. So we have all these interesting rock types within the Klamath Mountains Geomorphic Province, and that drives biodiversity. We also have, thankfully, some areas that are well protected, at least from the Westerner's perspective. And these are the wilderness areas with the within the Klamath Mountains. You can see some of the major roads. I have I-5 highlighted there in blue. And the red roads, 199 from Grants Pass to Crescent City, and then 96 and 299 in the central part of California section of the Klamath Mountains. And what's interesting when you drive these roads, or when you drive these roads, it's really hard to see the Klamath Mountains because they're such big shouldered river canyons that you're traveling through. Think of the Smith River on 199 if you've ever driven from Grants Pass to Crescent City or to Gold Beach. it's hard to see how tall these mountains are. We're kind of hidden along these river canyons on these roads. So the Klamath Mountains are a mystery to many people in that way because they don't see them. But how was this complex geomorphic province formed? I wish I could tell you the whole story. It's a fascinating 70-page chapter by Mark Bailey, but I'm just going to show you a couple of pictures real quick. I mentioned these island arc terrain accretions. So you think of these these volcanic igneous formations off the ocean. This is off in the ocean. This is this is hundreds of millions of years ago, 150 million to 200 million years ago, and older in some cases. And these island arcs are actually connected to the Blue Mountains of Oregon. It's a similar formation, similar feel when you're in the Wallowas of Eastern Oregon. The Klamath Mountains have a very similar feel to that because of these island arc accretions. But these terrains moved, they scraped onto the continent, and they were deposited into, and often flipped over into the current Klamath Mountains, and then often eroded again down. So you're looking at things that have been tossed and then eroded. Very complex once again. And you can see these arcing patterns within the geomorphic province of those accretionary events. You can also see the plutons that formed within as well. So again, hard to describe in a half-an-hour presentation, but here's the actual map that maps all of the terrains within the Klamath Mountains, and you can see how our simplified terrain map compares to the more complex one. So fascinating stuff, great story. We also have climate patterns, and you can see how in the western part of the Klamath Mountains, particularly from northern Humboldt County, where I live, north into Oregon, we're really at the southern tip of the great temperate coniferous forest, the greatest temperate coniferous forest on Earth. I consider Ferndale, which is just south of where I live in Eureka, Arcata area, to be the southern tip of the Pacific Northwest. And that is because of that influence of heavy moisture, historically anyway, into that coming off the ocean in the winter. So, over 100 inches of rain in pockets of Northwest California, and then obviously up into Oregon, that's true. But then as you move to the east, things dry out due to the orographic effect, but we also have an elevational gradient. And you can see the snow forests are highlighted in these smaller areas in the central part of, I don't think my cursor's working actually. Let me turn that on real quick. In the central part, these are the snow forests, and those create that elevational gradient. So right now with the storms that we just got, we are sitting prime. This area right behind me, which is in the Trinity Alps, is probably buried under 4 feet of snow right now because of the phenomenal storms we had over the past 3 weeks. In this picture here, this is Kelmiopsis leiciana. This is in Southwest Oregon. And you can see the orographic effect that those high mountains cause when storms hit the Klamath Mountains. So anyway, complex climate regimes. And then those climate regimes create amazing patterns within the water systems. And what's exceptional about the Klamath is we have 3 rivers that create water gaps through the range. That means that they actually cut through the Klamath Mountains. So we've got the Rogue River that cuts through, we've got the Klamath River that cuts through, and this is the Sacramento River that cuts through the Klamath Mountains. So what does that mean? Well, it means the mountains are old, right? And the rivers are old. So the mountains rise, the rivers cut through. So we have water gaps, exceptional river systems within the Klamath. And again, I just want to emphasize, great picture here of the Checo by Tim Palmer, but abiotic drives biotic. Tim helped with the water chapter. So I want to finish patterns with just a view of the plant communities. This is my bread and butter. This was the chapter that I spearheaded, and I brought in some other experts. Julie Evans is a vegetation specialist with the California Native Plant Society. Julie Kierstead is a phenomenal Klamath botanist. Michael Murray is a meadow expert. And then John Sawyer was my mentor at Cal Poly Humboldt when I got my master's degree. So all of them have contributed in some way to my understanding of these patterns within the vegetation. So let's look at the coastal forest. So like I said, this is the wet stuff, and I'm not going to go into major detail here, just show you some pictures, but this is where the massive trees grow, the giant Port Orford cedars, exceptional Douglas firs, and we even have redwoods within the Klamath Mountains. Not many, but we do have some. As you move inland along the river valleys, you get to the interior lowland forests. These are draped with ponderosa pine, sugar pine, also Douglas fir, which are omnipresent across the range, and fabulous plants like Darmera peltera, the umbrella plant, and redbuds and shooting stars. Oak woodlands, we're really at the northern extent of many oak woodlands oaks are much more common as you move south of Oregon in the California Floristic Province. Obviously, white oak woodlands are more common in Oregon than say the valley oak woodlands. But you can see this patchwork of oak woodland patterns, and this is of course driven in many respects by Native Americans, past, present, and into the future, the first peoples. So look at these patterns of the oak woodlands, often along river benches. The blue oak woodland here associating with chaparral, just fabulous biodiversity. The highest biodiversity is within the oak woodlands. Chaparral, we're at the northern extent of the California Floristic Province, which is kind of reached basically right around Grants Pass, a little bit to the north. And that's where chaparral tapers out. And we have two types of chaparral, or two general types of chaparral in the Klamath Mountains. We have montane chaparral, which you may be familiar with if you're on the north slopes, the south slopes high in the mountains. Things like Quercus vaccinifolia, the huckleberry oak will grow there. But also we have the more maritime chaparral that's common throughout the California Floristic Province, driven by fire and rapid reproduction of certain plants, like say toyon or different ceanothus, or another one of my favorite plants, manzanita species. We have serpentines, like I talked about. So these are those ophiolitic, heavy metal, crazy landscapes that you can walk out of a non-serpentine forest, and it's almost like you've entered the desert. And the Kelmiopsis wilderness is a great place to experience that sort of dichotomy. But you can see here that only certain plants have any sort of chance or ability to survive on serpentine. It's often pines. Pines are light dependent, so they kind of survive where other things, they lack the competition from other plants like a Douglas fir. But we also have these low growing things like you can see the manzanitas that are growing there and other endemics. So this is the serpentines within the Klamath Mountains. These are the largest outcrops of serpentine soil or ophiolitic soil in North America, and that drives endemism. So if you're looking for a plant that grows nowhere else within the on Earth, basically go to a serpentine outcrop in the Klamath Mountains, and there's probably going to be something there. Kelmiopsis leachiana in the bottom right corner there, case in point. Montane conifer forest. This is the forest that made me fall in love with California, fall in love with the West, and fall in love with, of course, the long-lived conifers of the world. And what's interesting about the conifer forests is they change from the west as you move to the east. Pines are much more common in the east, and as you move to the west, there's often endemic conifers, like we have the Brewer spruce, which grows nowhere else on Earth. Excuse me, foxtail pine that only grows in the southern Sierra Nevada and northern California within the Klamath Mountains. So phenomenal. This is the snow belt, right? This is driven by winter snowpack. And it excludes more of the broadleaf trees that grow at lower elevations. Conifers are just darn good at dealing with snow and cold, and also dealing with hot in the summer. And then the Sky Islands. So these are the highest peaks, and we don't really have huge mountains in the Klamath Mountains. The highest peaks are just over 9,000 feet. But these, what I've highlighted in yellow here in the top left, these are the areas above 7,000, 6,800 feet where high elevation species like whitebark pine and other endemics like this Mount Eddy polemonium in the bottom left grow. And then Juniper Woodlands. So this is the influence from the Great Basin Desert, particularly from Oregon, the Oregon Desert, the Eastern Oregon Desert, and the movement since the end of the Pleistocene, really, of these species that have been able to basically, thanks to certain birds, like the Townsend solitaire, have been able to distribute the juniper woodlands back into the Klamath Mountains as things have warmed again. And here's some patterns of that pretty rare vegetation type within the Klamath. And this is mostly just to the east of, to the west of Wairika. But there are endemics there, like these this phlox and the bedstraw on the right. All right, so biodiversity and adaptations. There's a lot of amazing stories here, and I'll do, like I said, I'm just going to touch on a few real quick. But one thing that I became super fascinated with as I did my research was the caves of the Klamath Mountains, and there's certain cavern regions. We're all familiar with Oregon caves. The Marble Mountains have caves. There's actually caves in central and southern Trinity County, California, and then there's some exceptional caverns around Shasta Lake in the far eastern part of the Klamath Mountains, just north of Redding. But the Graham's cave scorpion, did you know, fascinating stuff, that this is one of only a few discovered scorpion troglobites. Troglobites, of course, live underground, and it is currently known from one single cave in the Shasta limestone of the eastern Klamath. So we have an endemic scorpion. It's probably in more caves, maybe hasn't been discovered, but super cool. And then the Trogloraptor marching toni. This is a cool story. In 2010, a completely new family, genus, and species of spider was discovered by some cavers near around Grants Pass, Oregon. And basically, they found this thing, they took a picture, they sent it off, and bam, people were like, these entomologists were just blown away. So here we go, more diversity, cryptic diversity. That's a big story within the Klamath. Lots of things have yet to be discovered within this amazing mountain range. Amphibians. This is amazing. We have amphibians in the Klamath Mountains. What do we have? Well, we have 9 families. We have 26 species, 6 frogs, 20 salamanders. 32% are regionally endemic, and 48% of these are aquatic salamanders, which is kind of another part of a story that I'm not going to get into today. But let's look at these real quick. Not only do we have sort of, maybe newly speciated frogs, but we have the coastal tailed frog. And basically, the coastal tailed frog is one of these, what we call paleo endemics. It's been around on Earth for millions and millions and millions of years, and it's a basal lineage for all other 7,400 living frog species on Earth. So this is one of the, this frog's been around longer than almost any other frog on the planet. It has a few relatives around the globe. There's one in the Rocky Mountains, and there's one, I think it's in Australia. But basically, the bottom line is pretty cool. We've got this ancient frog. Now, how about the amphibians? Well, I wish I could touch on them all, but if we look at the Plethodons themselves, we have, like I said, we have 20 salamander species from 5 families. And within just the Plethodons, 2 of them are endemic. And one of them was just recently, and I say recently, in the past 15, 20 years, discovered. That recent discovery was the Scott Bar salamander along the Scott River. And then we have the Siskiyou salamander, which basically straddles the Oregon-California border, gets into the Applegate Valley of Oregon. But look at these beauties. And these pictures are all by Spencer Riffle, a phenomenal photographer from the Central Coast, San Luis Obispo, who contributed his photos to the book. And here's a little, this is a great graphic. So my buddy Justin, who is the co-editor, he's a true scientist. I'm more of a storytelling scientist. Justin's a true scientist. So he dug in and he was like, I want a heat map. I want to see where all our salamander diversity is, and I want to overlay that with our endemics. So here's our 7 endemic or near endemic. The Klamath black salamander sneaks out of the Klamath in a few areas in Northwest California. But basically, look at that endemism within the Klamath Mountains for salamanders. Look at those patterns of diversity, and obviously that diversity is higher in the eastern Klamath, the western Klamath, where we get more rain. But the limestone drives the diversity in this area. And these are where those caves were I was talking about. So even though it's drier there, there's places for the salamanders to go to stay cool and moist. All right, relationships. So this is a cool one, the Paleo fire reconstruction. I mean, it's cool, and it's also sort of alarming in a lot of ways. And it's a story that's just starting to be told. But people have cored lakes. Christy Riles is a scientist in Colorado who's done a lot of lake coring in the Klamath. And when you core, you see those layers, and those layers are deposition from year after year after year. You can look at the pollen. You can see what species were here 20,000 years ago versus what species are here today. But you can also look for charcoal core. And with that charcoal, they're able to see what historic fire return intervals were before 1900. So more frequent on certain aspects, which you might expect, less frequent in the western boundary, which you might expect because it's wetter. But why? Well, the story, as we know, as we're learning and growing as a culture of Western scientists, at least speaking for myself, is that this was driven by the first peoples of the Klamath. Fire is a tool. It was a tool. It continues to be a tool that drives biodiversity within oak woodlands. It might drive biodiversity on a serpentine meadowland to regenerate bear grass for cultural purposes. But you can see 15 tribes, at least within the Klamath Mountains, 10 different languages, it's believed. And this cultural diversity also drove biodiversity. And then what happened? Well, in 1900s, Westerners arrived and that fire was removed from the landscape. And this is something that we need to, are learning to how to heal, but also need to rapidly figure out how to heal. And so what this is this is when the fire, the charcoal, the fire scars on, this is actually a dendrochronological investigation where the fire scars were seen in tree cores and then they disappeared around 1900. So this is something that we need to re-heal the Klamath Mountains. Fire is coming back. But what does that fire do? Well, it sculpts vegetation. And really what I've learned, one of the big things I've learned in the process of creating this book is how much Native people drove the biodiversity within the Klamath Mountains, particularly in the vegetation types. And Frank Lake, some other Karuk, Lisa, and Leif Hillman were big parts in teaching me some of these lessons and also getting it into the book. And these ancient relationships, well, if it wasn't for the Yurok, we wouldn't have our condors returning. And I've heard, well, I know that the condors have actually flown into the Klamath Mountains. Let me show you the range map here. So condors, Pregonesh to the Yurok people. Condors are in the Klamath Mountains currently. They've been released in the Bald Hills of Redwood National Park. Many have heard this story, but they are now feeling courageous enough in their groupings to move further and further each day. They're still coming back to their holdings at night because they're fed. But these groups are moving and flying into the Klamath Mountains. It's not going to be long until they're up in Oregon. And this was like I said, totally due to a group of Yurok elders who were tasked with prioritizing natural and cultural resource restoration, and they targeted the condor. And it's been a phenomenal and uplifting and just heartwarming story for everyone in my region, and hopefully it will become a broader and more important story to everyone across the West, at least the Pacific Northwest. All right, perseverance. A couple more minutes here of storytelling, and I mentioned the caves earlier. And these are not bodies or anything. This is not it looks a little bit creepy here, but these are remains from animals in these limestone caves of the eastern Klamath. And this teaches us a lot of lessons about change since the end of the Pleistocene over the last 12 to 14,000 years. In the early 1900s, John Merriam and Annie Alexander from Berkeley began to document the caves of the eastern Klamath Mountains, and they unearthed all sorts of crazy stuff, including Triassic marine reptiles and Pleistocene fossils. And they collected these and they store them at the California Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley. So these are all still there. They did a nice job of cataloging and collecting them. And these continue to be used to refine our understanding of how California, the Klamath Mountains in particular, in this case, have shifted and changed since the Pleistocene. Well, how has that happened? Or what do we understand, I should say, to start with? And this is a lot of information here. And this is a graph or a table that I created in the mammal chapter. But this shows basically extinct species, shrub ox, pronghorn, which are no longer in the Klamath Mountains, though they're coming back and getting close. Mountain goats, bighorn sheep, all of these are no longer in the Klamath Mountains. Dire wolves, gray wolves are back. This graphic is already old. The gray wolves, obviously you all know that they're back in Oregon, but they've been traced and tracked into the Klamath Mountains in the last year and a half. So, phenomenal to see that Pleistocene fauna, understand what used to be here based on these caverns in the eastern Klamath Mountains. Well, and I just want to kind of, highlight one study, and this is Jessica Blows, who was at Stanford at the time she did this study. She's in the front of this picture. She went into Samwell and she dug into the pack rat middens, and she was able to see this change, more recent change. But pack rats, so they build these middens and they stash things in there, and they took animal bones that had been stored in the cave. I'm sorry, they took animal bones at the time when animals, 14, let's say 12,000 years ago, and stored them in their midden, and then things got buried. They're able to dig back in time and see what was there. So they went in with their hard hats, coveralls, and excavated several wood rat middens with these fossil deposits, and they analyzed the bone and took it back 18,000 years. Well, what did they find? Well, they found change, and they also found perseverance. They could interpret shifts in small mammal populations over time, and they could relate that to where these small mammals prefer to live today. So what they figured out was when the Pleistocene ended around 11,700 years ago, these communities were altered by their interplay of climate shifts, and then from colder and drier to warmer and wetter. And well, what does that mean? There was several extinction pulses that they were able to see in these small mammals and extrapolate to other mammals. But 11,000 and 7,500 years ago were two of these pulses. And they were able, it looks like I forgot the last little piece of it, but they were able to actually determine that things more generalists do well. So Perimiscus maniculatus, which is the common field mouse, they persisted throughout this time, but other species that were more specialized had went extinct within the Klamath, at least in this area. So it kind of leads that note that generalism within a changing climate is a better adaptation to survival. And then a little bit of a sad, but now again, uplifting story, the hidden lives of beavers within the Klamath. Beaver Central within the Klamath in 1836, explorers went into the verdant valley at the eastern edge of the range, and they claimed they found the finest beaver ground they had ever seen. Today, it's the Scott Valley. We know it as the Scott Valley. It used to be called Beaver Valley. But in a single year, 1850, they are said to have caught 1,800 beavers and shipped their pelts, of course, to Europe to make hats. But today, people in the Scott Valley, tribal people in the Karuk tribe that I know, are returning beavers to the landscape. They're slowing the flow of water, creating more permacultural, more healthy ecosystems, and working hard to help. And this, of course, helps everything from salmon to salamanders. So this interconnectedness, this interplay, this stewardship, this is the message, right? And then we have these ancient lineages of perseverance. I just want to show the mountain beaver because it is really cool. I've been lucky enough to see them a few times within the Klamath, but they are everywhere. This is one of the most ancient rodents on the planet, if not the most. All right, so change in stewardship. I'm going to wrap it up here real quick. The significance, well, it's about 12,000 square miles, right? So this is like the size of Vermont or New Hampshire. And it is home to one of the most biodiverse temperate mountain ranges on Earth. And I didn't mention one of the most biodiverse temperate coniferous forests on Earth as well. We are the conifer hotspot of the world for a temperate region. There's cryptic diversity. I mentioned some stuff. This is something from just last year that was discovered. This Siskiyou wingless stonefly. It's a new genus and species of stonefly. It was discovered in Southwest Oregon. So many more discoveries to be made is the point. But we also have to remember, and I think we all know this if you're on this call, but change is happening fast, right? This is my buddy, Justin. He's been doing a 20-year study in the Trinity Alps on a couple lake basins and salamanders and Cascades frogs, and he's just a herp nerd, which is great, obviously. But this picture, he took this first picture the first year of his study, and this picture in 2021. So look at that encroachment. Look at that forest encroachment because of the lack of fire. So change is happening fast. I guess I should have zoomed in. This is all due to the lack of fire, right? And then we have these mega high intensity fires. This is a picture I took in the Marble Mountains up top in 2004 and a retake of that same picture in 2019. We all know this story, right? The forests are too thick. We're drying because of climate change. We're losing biodiversity. But again, the Klamath Mountains are a gift. We're telling this love story so that we all start to understand and see and appreciate the Klamath Mountains just a little bit better. We hope that you latch on to a story from the Klamath Mountains. Maybe it's two, maybe it's the whole stinking book, and you start sharing some of those stories with your friends, and we all can come together, and maybe we can support the Scott Valley Watershed Council to put more beavers back, right? And lastly here, I have to highlight my son one more time because he's my favorite steward. I just want to emphasize natural history drives love, drives caring, and again, drives sustainability and stewardship. So thank you for listening to my love story.
Oh, thank you so much, Michael. That was a whirlwind to an amazing region. And I know there are people clamoring to hear more. And so I will encourage them to find your book. And if you don't win one in our raffle. So again, to remind folks that if you have questions for Michael, we'll get to those in just a couple of minutes. And I'm going to talk for a few minutes more before we get to those, but you can put them in the Q&A and we'll sort through those very soon. So again, I'm Chandra Legui with Oregon Wild, and I have had the opportunity working for Oregon Wild all this time to get out and explore many, many beautiful forests and landscapes and beautiful places in pursuit of my work with Oregon Wild and in writing Oregon's Ancient Forests, my hiking guide. And that took me to all sorts of forests all over the state, lots of different forest types. And, you know, they're all really special, but because we're honing in on the Klamath region tonight, that's for Oregon, the southwest corner of the state. So different forest types that I've been able to explore include little tiny pockets of quaking aspen that are in black on this map, vast swaths of ponderosa pine forest across central and eastern Oregon, the coastal forest with towering Sitka spruce, and of course our Douglas fir forests here in the Coast Range and foothills of the Cascades. But it really is the Siskiyou mixed conifer type, at least that's how we classified it for my book. And I know it gets a lot more crazy as you go into the rest of the Klamaths in California, but it's that Siskiyou mixed conifer that really blew me away as someone who is also a nature nerd and just loves to gobble up information. So Michael's work to lay out what all the different conifers are is fascinating to me because there really are amazing forests down in that neck of the woods. So I did love exploring this part of Oregon and I'm going to kind of talk about Southwest Oregon. That's a little bit broader than the Klamath region that is on Michael's maps. So including a little bit more to the east of Ashland and including the Siskiyou Crest. But here's just a couple of images from places that I got to explore in writing my book. This is an area that former Oregon Wild staffer Wendell Wood loved very much, a great mentor of mine and other colleagues. And Southwest Oregon is also where some of Oregon Wild's most important allies and partners are based for very good reason. There's just so much great stuff to be concerned about, care about, love, as Michael described. So Oregon Wild was created in 1974, and our mission is to protect and restore Oregon's wildlands, wildlife, and waters as an enduring legacy for all Oregonians. Today, we have almost 20 staff in offices in Portland Bend, Eugene, and a few other field offices, and over 20,000 members and supporters like folks like you. And across our 5 decades, we've successfully protected nearly 2 million acres of wilderness, over 2,000 miles of wild and scenic rivers, countless endangered wildlife such as gray wolves and salmon, vast stretches of old growth forests, and essential ecosystems all across the state. And the Southwest Oregon Klamath region has always been an instrumental part of our work. So the wildlands of Southwest Oregon are some of the most extensive and important for Oregon. So we've worked to protect places from the Wild Rogue to the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument, pictured here. Here's a map that highlights the sort of timeline of wilderness protections that have been added across Oregon over time. So way back in 1964, when the original Wilderness Act was passed, it included the Kelmiopsis wilderness down in where it says Siskiyou's here on this map. In 78, that was expanded and the Wild Rogue wilderness was designated. Smaller pieces, including the Grassy Knob wilderness and Red Buttes wilderness, were added in 84. And then in 2009, the Copper Salmon wilderness and Soda Mountain wilderness were added in this region. Other protections that we worked to gain via the roadless, or with the roadless rule in the early 2000s, the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument back in 2000, with expansions just a few years ago in 2017. And of course, the Cascade-Siskiyou National Monument was is the only national monument to be designated for its biodiversity on the edge of the region that Michael defined, but definitely part of this amazingly diverse area. So I'm going to slide, oh, there's the Copper Salmon wilderness. And I'm going to slide in a little piece here to show around the existing Kelmiopsis wilderness and Wild Rogue wilderness, some potential wilderness area expansion. Those are wild roadless lands protected under the roadless rule that still need wilderness protection. The Wild Rogue expansion would protect much of this amazing watershed. And there's been a bill to protect this area introduced and pending for years now, much thanks to Oregon senators and now retired Representative Peter DeFazio, but it still hasn't passed the finish line. So we're hoping that we can help move that forward soon. Oregon Wild's work to protect wildlife and various species from extinction, and as well as protect their habitat from logging and fragmentation, has been essential to helping species in this region as well. So from salmon to spotted owls to martins and fishers and species we maybe haven't seen, our wildlife program is always paying attention to this amazing area. And I'm so glad that Michael talked about condors already, so I can keep this quick, but it's very exciting to think about this amazing bird, North America's largest flying bird, returning back to this region from which it was extirpated. If you go to this link, OregonWild.org/California Condor, we have a bunch of resources. We worked on a podcast and have been helping to promote the UROC's work, releasing condors into the wild, which is really amazing. On the waters front, this region, as Michael noted, has some really important waterways that flow through these wild lands. There's several designated wild and scenic rivers, the Rogue River, Illinois, Chetco, and Elk, and importantly, some tributaries to the Rogue and Elk that were just added in 2019. And you can see those, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but you can see in purple on this map, current wild and scenic rivers. And so you can see a cluster, you can see the big rivers down here in the southwest corner, and the sort of groupings are tributaries to the Rogue and Elk that were just added. All of these other blue lines on this map are proposed under the River Democracy Act, a piece of legislation that we've been working with Senator Wyden on for the last few years that would protect thousands of miles of streams across Oregon. Many of those, as you can see, are in this region, tributaries to the Illinois, the Chetco, and Rogue, such as Indigo Creek, which should come up here in a second. Headwaters of the Applegate River, such as Mule Creek, and other important streams. Last month, Senator Wyden announced a revised River Democracy Act bill that would drop some of these streams in this region And so your voices are needed to ensure that important protections are maintained in that bill and that it will move forward. So you can learn more about that on Oregon Wild's website. So while most of the wildlands and ancient forests in Oregon are found in national forests, in Southwest Oregon, many are instead managed by the Bureau of Land Management. With more aggressive logging practices on these BLM lands, the remaining ancient forests of the region are under threat. So we have been working for decades to stop logging of some of these really precious forests, many right in our backyards due to the mixed land ownership of this region, which you can see with the sort of purple and gray checkerboard, especially in Southwest Oregon. These forests are truly special for many reasons, not least of which is their climate or their carbon storage potential. So forests in this region have been identified by climate scientists as being a really high priority for protecting biodiversity, climate resilience, and carbon storage. So this is a really complicated looking map, but you can see that here they identify areas that are needed to protect to meet the global effort to preserve at least 30% of wildlands, combat climate change. And there's some definite hotspots in Southwest Oregon. So drawing on that science that says that forests, especially mature and old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest, can sequester and store vast amounts of carbon while providing benefits like clean water and wildlife habitat, we're calling on the Biden administration to enact a rule to protect these forests as a cornerstone of US climate policy. So as part of our climate forest campaign, and you can see the website up there to get more information, we and our many partners are highlighting several logging sales that target these old forests, and some of them are found here in this really special region. Biden's executive order issued last April highlighted the need to identify and protect these carbon storing forests. And we're hopeful after the recent withdrawal of the flat country timber sale on the Willamette National Forest that federal agencies, including the BLM, will put a stop to these outdated logging projects. That won't happen without continued support of folks like you who care about these special places, who love them and pass it on, and about our future. So that's a lot in store for 2023, just for this region that Oregon Wild's working on. It's wonderful to know that down in California, there's a lot of great science going on and appreciation of this amazing place too. So it's great to spill over the border into the white places of Oregon Wild's maps and learn more about the Klamath Mountains. So I will leave it there and try to get to these questions. I'm going to stop my share. And of course, since I was talking, I wasn't looking at all of the great questions coming in. But we had a couple about the trees in the area. I think, I don't know, I know you can't probably list off, I bet you could list off all the comments, Michael. I don't know if I want you to do that, but what's the number, how many conifer trees are in the Klamath Mountains?
There's well, you know, a couple have disappeared. There used to be McNabb cypress under the reservoir, the Whiskeytown Reservoir. And a new one's actually been documented, but you know, the question is, when did it arrive? But Torreya californica has recently been found in the Klamath along the Sacramento watershed. But you know, 32 to 35, depending on where boundaries are drawn, including two near endemics, including the Port Orford cedar and the Brewer spruce and the foxtail pine. So yeah, and I put, somebody asked that, I put a link to my book, a little bit self-promotion, but you know, it's all in conifer country. That was my master's thesis at Cal Poly Humboldt, to map and write about the ecology of the conifers.
Awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of good questions. I kind of frantically typed some answers. Andrew Aldrich asked a really good one, and I couldn't even think to how to type that one. So let me read that real quick.
Yeah, please do.
Oh, good. Tim's on. Thanks, Tim. Great. Tim Palmer, great presentation. Thank you. He says, Appreciate that, Tim. Let me see, where's Andrew's? Shucks, I'm not very good at navigating.
Oh, I just saw
Oh, there
it.
it
It was
is.
about,
Okay,
it
it
was about
says-
drawing about
yeah.
boundaries.
Right, so this was complicated. So Andrew says, can you talk about the process through which the boundaries of the Klamath Mountains were chosen? Were a lot of people involved or a few? Were they geologists or different kinds of scientists? The answer is is complicated. So the California Klamath Mountains are easy. Like it's kind of like it's easily definable. I mean, if you drive from Arcata east, like you hit this wall and you're like, we're in the Klamath Mountains. But what happens in Oregon, and then in this, I'm not an expert at this, but what happens, I think, is that old rock starts to overlay, because the Klamath get a lot lower in Oregon, right? So that old rock starts to overlay, the new rock starts to overlay that old rock. And, the best example of this, and I've never been here and it's on my bucket list, but it's Iron Mountain. And Iron Mountain is the northern range extension of the Brewer Spruce. And that is technically just outside of the boundary we drew because it doesn't fit, it's like this little ophiolitic outcrop, right? That's just outside of the more big chunk. So it was tricky and it's not perfect in Oregon. But we did our best and we did rely on geologists. We relied on watershed boundaries as well, the Rogue in particular, because we wanted to be able to define, actually, honestly, for fish, it made it easier to just use the Rogue watershed as the northern boundary to be able to define the fish flora or fish fauna within Oregon there. So yeah, complicated. California easy, Oregon not. So thanks for that question, Andrew.
Great.
And then I just lost the question, so maybe you could really win.
I'm trying to sort through. Well, Barbara Yulian is asking about the Kelmiopsis being a subrange of the Klamath Mountains.
Yep.
And that the Kelmiopsis subrange not only includes the congressionally designated wilderness, but also the surrounding unprotected roadless areas, the north and south Kelmiopsis. And if you had an opinion about that.
I think it's one of those unnamed appellations. Some people call it an extension of the Siskiyous. Some people call it the Kelmiopsis. On our map, I forget what we ended up going with. I should look real quick. I think we might have just called it the Kelmiopsis. No, we called it the Siskiyous in the book, which, it's similar to the Siskiyous in a lot of ways because it's heavy on the Serpentine, but I almost feel like it deserves its own name and nobody's named it. So let's do it. Maybe second edition. Should I call it the Kelmiopsis range? I don't know.
You take that up with Barbara.
Yeah.
Probably some others too. Cool. Yeah. Let's see. Marion asked about special interactions between Manzanita species and certain conifers, and if you could speak to that.
Well, that's sort of why I fell in love with the Manzanitas, is because every time I went and found some cool conifer stand, there was always Manzanitas underneath. And Manzanitas are similar to conifers. Ericaceous plants are always with conifers, right? So these are everything from rhododendrons to the Kelmiopsis to huckleberries to Manzanitas, right? So they're hardy. They must have a very, I'm not an expert on mycorrhizae, but they must have a similar relationship with mycorrhizae where they deal with these harsh conditions. They also deal with, they also like, in certain instances, a lot of instances, that lack of competition that comes with a more fertile soil type. So, but are they connected underground? Probably, but I don't know that full relationship, but I just think it's really fascinating the way conifers and ericaceous plants are always found together. Like ericaceous in my mind are sort of the gymnosperms of the flowering plant world as far as ecology goes.
It's, different, but I guess similar in the, to, fungal and mycorrhizal connections between plants is so fascinating. So yeah, plant to plant interactions. It's really cool.
Yeah.
Someone asked a pretty complicated question that maybe you can elaborate on. Just the idea of humans managing the landscape for a long time and helping to shape the different vegetation types. You people could make the argument that we need to be doing more logging and grazing and intervention in order to, keep the forest healthy, if that's what the native people were doing. But I think there's some big differences in thinking about the way that people once managed the landscape and how we might do it now. So,
I'll just touch on that. It's a good question. It's a legitimate thought to have. Obviously, I mean, the bottom line is, though, we have to think about, since the end of the Pleistocene, things have changed drastically, right? Like there were massive ice sheets covering, vast areas of the West. Those ice sheets didn't necessarily creep into the Klamath, but, they crept into California through the Sierra Nevada, certain areas like that. But, we didn't have white bark pine in the Klamath Mountains 15,000 years ago. That's a more recent arrival. Same with subalpine fir is the theory with subalpine fir. They haven't been there all that long. So as these ice sheets retreated, forest types shifted. John Sawyer used to make the argument that the redwood forests that we see, even though the trees are, 3,000-4,000 years old, they're really not. These forest types have just recently formed, because climates are changing so much. So I think it's this complex story of major shifts in climate, but also the arrival of the first peoples, whether that was 15 or 20, 25, 30,000 years ago. We're still learning that. When did that all happen? But at least in our area, I think it's relatively safe to say that influence is about 15,000 years old, because we are, we're reaching into that northern area where the Pleistocene had major effects. It was cold, so they say.
And I might add that, just more from a philosophical point of view, I mean, the ways that humans can manipulate the landscape today are very different than the traditional ways that people did it, which was mostly with fire. And the extent that we can manipulate the landscape is really different today. I mean, the logging and grazing and building of roads, et cetera, is way beyond the management that was done in the past. And it's kind of the opposite of maintaining forest health. It's manipulating it for, on a vast landscape for production purposes. And I think that's different from what the indigenous people were doing.
Yeah, and I would almost argue in certain instances, based on what we're learning with giant sequoias, particularly in California, and other people are coming to this same determination, but we do need to thin forests. We need to actively thin, masticate, get some of that biomass out of there. So yes, logging, I think it's kind of got this aura about it. Obviously, logging is bad, but a lot of it needs to happen now, because we've just let this 100 years of growth happen. And I'm gonna be doing some vegetation sampling. Well, fingers crossed, we're putting in an RFP for it across the Klamath Mountains. And I'm going to focus on some of these conifer forests that are being encroached, particularly foxtail pine forests, and make the argument that we need to get some of that fir that's arrived in these foxtail pines over the last 100 years. Let's get in there and get it out, because that's what's going to save the rare stuff. So
what's your take on using fire, prescribed fire as
well, I'm not an expert in that. I'm learning, but I do believe that maybe it's some logging coupled with burn piles, but yeah, I think in the right circumstance, definitely. Like, fire needs to be broader, have a broader reach.
Yeah. And I'll say from Oregon Wild's perspective that we take a pretty nuanced view to where logging should be used to do that sort of thinning, to in forest types where the fuels have really grown in, and it's a changed type of forest because we've excluded fire, as opposed to logging for the sake of just production.
Yeah.
So, we can revisit that if anybody wants to send me an email. We're running out of time, but I see one question about pika, and I can't pass it up because those are really cool animals. Someone says they haven't heard of any pika being in the Klamath Mountains. I know they're found in the Cascades and to the east in the Monument. What do you know about the presence or not of pika?
No pika, no marmot anymore, but they are right across the Siskiyou Crest, like you're saying, in the Cascades there of Oregon in particular. They're obviously on Mount Shasta too. I actually are marmot. I don't think marmots are on Mount Shasta, but I know pika are on Mount Shasta. They're also in the Medicine Mountain area, and they're in the Warners. And there is evidence of them in those caves. So yeah, they found, so that the end of they basically disappeared at the end of the Pleistocene, or maybe it was at that 7,000 year extinction event, or 11,000 year. I can't exactly remember, but of course that has to do with the climate change and then the shift in the food availability that the pika utilized. We're just not quite high enough, like I said, we're about 9,000 feet is the high point in the both Mount Eddy and Thompson Peak in the Trinity Alps. So those two peaks are right above 9,000 feet, and that's it. So,
well, maybe they'll find a home someday.
yeah.
along with wolves that might move into the areas.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael, for again giving us that amazing tour of this really cool region. And thanks everyone for joining us tonight and tuning in. You can again seek out this book, The Natural History of the Klamath Mountains, at Backcountry Press.
Yes. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Have a good night.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.